A 26-year-old woman showed up at a homeless camp in Reno with a handmade cart, a set of hand tools, and a plan nobody believed. 14 days later, she built a wooden box that stayed warm at -10 using nothing but physics and scrap lumber everyone else threw away. Like and subscribe. There is a particular kind of cold that settles over the high desert east of Reno in late October. Not the dramatic cold of mountain storms, but a dry, patient cold that arrives without announcement and stays without apology. It comes in off the flats after dark and finds every gap in every layer of clothing, in every crack in every wall, and it does not hurry because it knows it has months ahead of it. It was into this kind of cold, on an evening in late October of 2009, that Mara Callan arrived at the Eastgate Rail Corridor, pulling a homemade cart with mismatched wheels that squeaked on every rotation. She was 26 years old, though the way she moved, deliberate, unhurried, with a quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned the cost of inattention, might have suggested someone older. She had dark brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, and eyes the color of weathered slate that took in her surroundings the way a surveyor takes in a site before touching a single instrument. Her jacket was an olive drab canvas work coat, heavy and worn at the elbows. Her boots were lace-up work boots with the right toe wrapped in silver duct tape, pressed flat and smooth, with the care of someone who understood that maintenance was not vanity, but engineering. The cart she pulled carried a sleeping bag, a canvas bag of personal items, several coils of rope in different thicknesses and materials, and a set of hand tools wrapped in oilcloth. A Japanese pole saw, a combination square, a hammer, a hand drill with a bit roll, and a small level no longer than her forearm. People who later tried to understand what happened that winter at the Eastgate camp usually began the story at the wrong place. They began it with the cold, or with the building, or with the night Frank Delano put his hand against a wall that had no right to be warm and found that it was. But the story actually began years earlier, in a classroom at the University of Nevada, where a 22-year-old architecture student stood up during a design review and told the department chair, in front of 30 people, that his foundational argument about thermal bridging in residential wall assemblies was not only wrong, but demonstrably wrong, and that she could show him the calculations. She had shown him the calculations. He had failed her. She had appealed. The appeal had gone nowhere. And then she had packed the tools she had used during 2 summers of passive house construction internships in Portland, built a cart from salvaged metal, and come to the place where the only credential that mattered was what you could actually build. She parked the cart near the east fence of the Eastgate yard, looked at the row of weathered pallets stacked against it, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite calm, but was close to it. The particular steadiness of a person who has arrived at the place where the work can finally begin. The Eastgate Rail Corridor had been a functioning freight distribution hub until the financial collapse of 2008 shut down the logistics company that operated it, and the site had been in legal limbo ever since. Too costly to demolish, too contaminated for immediate redevelopment, too remote from city services to attract much official attention. About 35 people lived in or near it through the colder months, sheltered by a combination of commercial dome tents, tarp and salvage lean-tos, and a few more substantial structures built by people with more time and more material than the average new arrival. The most established of these belonged to Frank Delano, 52, a large, broad-shouldered man with a graying mustache, and the particular authority of someone who had been somewhere long enough to feel entitled to an opinion about everyone who came after. Frank had a plywood enclosure with an actual door and a corrugated plastic roofing panel that shed water passably well, and he heated it with a propane camp stove. He ran at low output on cold nights, an arrangement that worried him less on account of the carbon monoxide risk than on account of the cost of refills. He had been at Eastgate for 3 winters, and he carried that fact the way some people carry a title. Danny Shue was 31, thin, and perpetually wrapped in an orange-down vest that had lost most of its loft, and he had a gift for identifying reasons why things would not work that he deployed with the consistency of someone who had made it a personal practice. Lorraine Bishop was 60, a former elementary school teacher from Carson City, and she had a quality of stillness that came from years of managing rooms full of children, the ability to observe without reacting, to hold a question until the right moment to ask it. These 3 people were not the entire camp, but they were the ones who would matter most to what happened over the next 4 months. Mara spoke to none of them on her first night. She set up her sleeping bag against the east fence near the pallet row, ate something from a foil pouch, and lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the camp. The canvas flutter of tents, the low murmur of a propane flame from Frank's direction, the distant sound of a train moving through the city proper several miles to the west. She was not afraid. She was thinking about wood. Specifically, she was thinking about the pallets stacked along the fence above her head, and about a dumpster she had seen from the road on Sutherland Avenue on her walk in, piled high with rigid foam offcuts from what appeared to be a commercial renovation in progress, and about the abandoned framing site she had noticed on Mineral Ridge 3 days earlier, with its pile of untreated structural lumber sitting in the open without anyone watching it. She was already building the thing in her head. Mara spent her first 2 full days at the camp doing nothing that looked like construction. She walked. She covered the neighborhoods within hauling distance of the yard, in careful loops, moving at the pace of someone with nowhere to be. Though her eyes were doing the opposite of resting, she was cataloging. The Sutherland renovation dumpster was as good as she had hoped. Not just foam offcuts, but full-face pieces trimmed around mechanical penetrations and corners, pieces too small for the contractor to store, but carrying thermal resistance values that still meant something if you cut them correctly and placed them where their properties mattered. She noted the dumpster's pickup schedule from the sticker on the side and adjusted her mental timeline accordingly. The Mineral Ridge framing site yielded structural 2x6s that had been sitting weathered on one face, but were still sound through the core. She tested 3 pieces with the flat of her thumbnail, pressing into the end grain, and found the fiber density she was looking for. A closed furniture store 2 blocks south of Sutherland was in the early stages of teardown, and the crew tossing material into the alley had left behind a stack of 3/4-inch cabinet-grade plywood panels, warped on the edges from weather, but flat in the centers, where the mass of the panel had resisted movement. She did not touch any of it yet. She looked. She measured distances. She thought about load-bearing capacity per trip on the cart. She thought about sequencing, what needed to come first, what could wait, what would disappear if she waited too long. On the second evening, she sat near the pallet row with a piece of cardboard and a pencil stub and drew a floor plan the size of a sheet of paper. Not a formal drawing, but a thinking tool, the kind of quick study she had learned to make during her internship summers in Portland, where the lead designer had a habit of saying that any structure you could not explain on a napkin was a structure you did not yet understand. The dimensions she settled on were 72 inches long, 42 inches wide, and 52 inches tall at the ridge. Small by any standard anyone at the camp would have recognized as shelter. Deliberately small, for reasons that had nothing to do with the amount of available material and everything to do with physics. It was during this second evening of planning that Pete Harlow first noticed her. Pete was 55, a former electrician from Sacramento, lean and weathered, with a way of moving through the camp that suggested familiarity with the lines between what was his and what was available. He came to the Eastgate yard most mornings to collect scrap metal and salvageable electrical components from the edges of the site and sell them at a recycler on Commerce Loop. When he saw Mara cataloging the pallet row and the south fence material pile with an expression he could not fully interpret, he felt something tighten in his chest that he would have described, if pressed, as territorial, though the word he used to Danny Shue that evening was different. He said the new girl was going to be a problem. Danny said she was going to be a cold girl in a wet sleeping bag by Thursday. Neither of them was right. The collection phase began on Mara's 3rd morning at Eastgate and ran for 8 days, and anyone watching the camp from the outside during that period would have seen only an unremarkable sequence of small trips. A young woman with a squeaking cart leaving early and returning loaded, sorting material against the east fence in careful piles, and repeating the cycle. The regularity of it was, itself, a kind of statement, though it was not intended as one. Mara was up before 5 most mornings, moving through her circuit of 4 sites in the pre-dawn quiet before job site personnel and demolition crews arrived. She averaged 3 loaded trips per day. She sorted everything as she unloaded. Structural lumber sound, enough to carry load in one pile. Thinner board stock and facing material in a second. Unusable scraps in a third pile she left open for anyone who wanted firewood. And that third pile turned over completely every day. The first 2 piles stayed untouched because nobody else could see what they were for yet. Frank Delano came over on the fifth morning and looked at the sorted material without speaking for a moment. Then he said it looked like she was planning to build something. Mara said she was. Frank asked what? Mara described the sleeping box and its dimensions. Frank said those were the dimensions of a coffin. Mara said the dimensions were similar, but the purpose was different. Frank said it was going to be freezing inside a wooden box. Mara said it was going to be the opposite of that. Frank looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, skepticism and something older than skepticism, a reluctant alertness, the look of a person whose certainty is not quite as solid as it was a minute ago. He walked away without further comment. Danny Shu was less ambiguous. He told anyone who would listen that the foam offcuts Mara had hauled from Sutherland were compromised by weather exposure and would be structurally useless inside a wall cavity. He was wrong about this. Mara did not correct him. On the seventh day, Lorraine Bishop came over and asked specific questions, not doubtful questions, but practical ones, the kind that come from a person who is genuinely trying to understand rather than genuinely trying to identify failure modes. She asked about the floor particularly, whether Mara planned to insulate beneath it, because she had learned from sleeping on the ground in 2 previous winters that cold moved upward through concrete and asphalt faster than it moved through any wall. Mara told her she was right, and that the floor had been the part she had spent the most time on. She showed Lorraine the cardboard sketch. Lorraine said it looked like it might actually work. She offered to bring back foam material if she passed near Sutherland on her walk the following day. Mara said she appreciated that, and she meant it, not just for the material, but for the quality of attention Lorraine had brought to the question. It was, in a context where most attention was either hostile or indifferent, something she had not expected and did not take for granted. Mara began construction on the 9th day, and anyone watching that first morning would have seen something that did not immediately announce itself as unusual. There were no power tools, no generator, no material deliveries, no crew. There was a young woman in a work coat setting up a makeshift saw bench from 2 stacked pallets and beginning to work through a pile of sorted lumber with a Japanese pole saw and a combination square. What made it unusual was visible only if you watched long enough and knew what you were looking at. She did not measure in the conventional sense. She cut a reference piece and used it to mark the next cut and the one after that, working from the actual material rather than from numbers on a tape, a technique used in timber framing because it eliminates the cumulative error that creeps into long sequences of tape measurements. Her cuts were clean, her joints were fitted by hand until the mating surfaces sat flush without a gap she could feel with her thumbnail. She worked without hesitation, which is the outward sign of a person whose planning is complete enough that execution is no longer a problem to solve, but a sequence to execute. The floor platform went down first. She shimmed the pallet corners level before laying a single deck board, because she understood that a floor that is not level creates stress at every joint above it that compounds as the structure rises. The deck boards were fitted with a tightness that left no visible seam at the joints, because infiltration from below is one of the primary channels of heat loss in a raised structure, and a tight deck was not an aesthetic choice, but a thermal one. The wall frames were built flat on the ground and raised and connected at the corners with half-lap joints reinforced with wooden pegs driven through pre-bored holes because her nail supply was limited and she wanted to save metal fasteners for connections that truly required them. It was on the second afternoon of framing, while Mara was fitting the second wall section, that a city field inspector named Tom Brecker walked through the gate of the Eastgate yard on what his paperwork described as a routine site assessment for potential redevelopment planning. He stopped when he saw the framing taking shape near the east fence. He stood watching for a moment, then walked over and asked what she was building. Mara looked up from the joint she was fitting and said she was building a place to sleep that would not kill her in January. Tom looked at the half-lap corner joint she had just cut, clean and flush and fitted without a gap, and then looked at the hand tools laid out on the saw bench, and then looked at her. He did not say what he was thinking. He took out his phone and photographed the structure from 2 angles, made a notation in his site assessment form, and before he walked on, he handed her a city business card with his name and contact information on it, the way inspectors sometimes do when they intend to follow up on a site. Mara watched him go and then went back to the joint she was fitting. That evening, Frank Delano told Danny Shu that he had watched the new girl cut 4 half-lap joints that afternoon, and that all 4 had come out cleaner than most of the joining he had done with a power miter saw. Danny said maybe she had done carpentry before. Frank said maybe she had done more than carpentry. He did not say it like a compliment exactly, but it had the same content as one. She moved in on the evening of the 14th day. The temperature that night dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit, which in the high desert east of Reno is not a record and not a crisis, but is the kind of cold that makes the difference between sleeping and not sleeping, between a night that restores a person and a night that takes something from them. The interior of the sleeping box was 65 inches long, 35 inches wide, and 48 inches high at the ridge. Enough room to lie flat with arms at the sides and sit upright without the crown of the head touching the roof. The floor was raised on a pallet platform with compacted cardboard layered flat between the runners and foam offcuts fitted tight across the top, and the deck boards laid over it were close-fitted and smooth. And the sleeping pad she unrolled over them felt, in the small enclosed space, more substantial than its half-inch thickness had any right to suggest. She set a single candle in a clay saucer near the center of the floor and lit it, not primarily for heat, but for information. The candle flame stood nearly vertical and moved only when she breathed directly toward it, which told her what she needed to know about infiltration. She lay down in her sleeping bag, pulled the door closed against its foam weather stripping until she heard the latch catch and felt the faint pressure change that a well-sealed door produces, and she waited. The blue hardcover notebook she had been carrying since Portland sat open on the floor beside the candle saucer, the pencil laying in the spine. She had already written the outside temperature, 23 degrees, from the radio weather report and the time, and the candle status, vertical, minimal movement. She wrote those things the way she had been trained to write site observations during her internship, without editorializing, because data that is dressed up in interpretation is no longer data. By 10 o'clock, the small analog thermometer she had salvaged from an abandoned storefront on her collection circuit read 38 degrees inside. By midnight, it read 42. Outside, it was still 23. The difference of 19 degrees, just stained by nothing more than one human body and one candle in a well-built enclosure, was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things are dramatic. There was no moment of revelation, no sudden warmth. There was simply a slow accumulation, heat generated, contained, preserved, the physical logic of the structure expressing itself quietly in degrees. She wrote the numbers in the notebook. Then she blew out the candle because she had learned what she needed from it. In the darkness, she could feel the difference between this night and the 13 nights before it. On those nights, the cold had been a presence, patient and insistent, something she managed rather than rested through. Tonight, it was outside. She was inside. The wall between those two conditions was 3.5 inches of fitted wood with a foam-filled cavity, but it held the line between them with a firmness that no tent she had ever owned had managed. She slept without waking. When she wrote in the notebook the following morning, outside temperature 21, inside temperature 40, candle untested, she left a single line of space after the numbers before turning the page. That space was not a flourish. It was a notation of something that did not fit in a column, but that she needed to acknowledge, that she had been right, and that being right, when it finally arrived after years of being told otherwise, felt less like vindication and more like a quiet door closing on something that no longer needed to be carried. The cold that settled over Reno in January of that winter arrived in stages, each stage arriving before the last one had finished making its point. By the second week of the month, the overnight lows were sitting between -10 and -15 Fahrenheit, which is the kind of cold that stops being a weather condition and starts being a problem to be solved in real time. It found Frank Delano's plywood enclosure at the roof panel seams and the gaps around the doorframe, and through the plywood itself, which resists thermal conduction only marginally better than a sheet of construction paper. Frank slept with a heavy sleeping bag and a wool blanket and ran his propane stove at low output, and woke anyway on the worst nights with the specific deep chill that comes from cold that has been working in a person for hours before they notice. He had run out of propane on the morning of January 9th, and his usual supplier had been unreachable for 3 days. He had been calculating his options since that morning, the cost of a taxi to the refill station, whether anyone in the camp had a functioning vehicle, whether he could get through another night in the bag alone without the stove, when the temperature outside passed through zero on its way down, and he understood that the calculation had resolved itself. He walked to the wooden structure at the east fence and knocked. There was a pause, then the door opened inward against its weather stripping with the faint suck of a well-sealed enclosure, releasing pressure, and Mara looked out at him from the warm interior. Frank asked if he could stay. Mara moved her bag to one side and said yes without elaboration. Frank came in and pulled the door closed behind him and sat with his back against the interior wall and did not speak for a long time. Then he reached behind him and placed his palm flat against the wall surface. He held it there. The wall was warm, not warm like a heated room, but warm in the specific way of a surface that has been retaining rather than shedding the heat on the other side of it. Frank said he had expected it to feel like being inside a wooden refrigerator. Mara explained that the foam in the wall cavity was acting as a thermal break, absorbing heat before it could migrate through the wood to the exterior skin and dissipate. Frank listened with the quality of attention of someone who is revising a significant assumption in real time. He lay down in his coat with his back to the door and was asleep in less than an hour. He slept through the night. When Mara checked the thermometer at first light, the interior read 34 degrees. Outside it was -11. The difference was 45 degrees, held by 3.5 inches of wood and foam and the combined heat of two sleeping bodies. In the morning, he asked Mara to walk him through the wall system. She took him outside and described each layer: the interior facing, the cavity gap, the foam fill, the exterior skin, the raised floor, the door seal, with the same patience she brought to every explanation, which was the patience of a person for whom the subject was interesting, rather than the patience of a person performing tolerance. When she was done, Frank stood looking at the structure for a moment. He said he had built houses for 12 years and had never built anything like this. Then he said the thing that cost him something to say, that he had spent the first 2 weeks calling it a coffin and that he had been wrong. She did not say she knew. She did not say it had taken long enough. She said she appreciated it, and the simplicity of that response was, in the context of everything Frank had said in the previous 2 weeks, its own kind of answer. In the weeks that followed, Mara explained the construction principles of her sleeping box to anyone who asked, and she explained them the same way each time, without performance, without the residual satisfaction of someone who had been doubted and was now proven right, without adjusting the explanation based on how skeptical the person asking had been before the cold made them curious. She answered the question that was asked, showed the detail that was relevant, and let the information stand without commentary on the path that had led to the moment of asking. Danny Shu came over 4 days after Frank's overnight stay and asked, without preamble, whether the foam weather stripping on the door was a specific product or whether any dense foam would work. Mara told him any closed-cell foam of sufficient density would hold a compressed seal, and showed him the strip she had used, which she had pulled from a discarded window unit found near the rail maintenance building. Danny looked at it, said nothing, and left. 3 days later, Mara noticed he had added a foam strip to the door of his dome tent. Not the right kind, a softer foam that would compress too far, but the right principle applied with available material. She said nothing about the difference in foam density. It was not her door. Lorraine Bishop asked Mara directly if she would help her build something. She had materials, not enough for a full replica, but enough for a version of the principle. They spent 2 afternoons on it together, building a sleeping box roughly half Mara's size, with a single skin close-fitted wall, cardboard layered and compacted into the stud cavity instead of foam, and a floor raised on short wooden blocks with layered cardboard packed below the deck. When Lorraine slept through the first hard cold night in it and knocked on Mara's door in the morning to report it, she stood in the doorway for a moment afterward and said it felt like science, like someone had actually thought the problem through from the beginning. Mara said that was all it was, thinking the problem through. She said the thinking had been done by people long before her, by anyone who had ever built a root cellar or a log granary or understood that wood resists heat loss and enclosed air is thermal mass, and small, tight volumes lose heat slowly, and that these facts do not change based on whether the person applying them has a building permit or a mortgage or a set of power tools. There was a boy named Caleb Marsh who had been present for most of this without being asked, 19 years old, from the encampment in the adjacent park, who had begun appearing alongside Mara on her early morning material runs without explanation about 3 weeks into her stay at Eastgate. He helped push the cart uphill without being asked and did not fill the silence with talk. and Mara noticed after the third morning that he was carrying a pen and marking his forearm during the collection walks with notations she could not read from the side. She began narrating her decisions during those walks, explaining why she selected one board and left the next one, what she was reading in the end grain, why fiber orientation mattered for a given load path. Caleb transferred the arm notations to paper in the evenings. He did not ask questions, but his presence had the quality of a question being asked continuously, and Mara answered it. In late February, a social worker named Sandra Vale arrived at the Eastgate camp on an outreach visit and spent 2 hours talking with Mara about the sleeping box. Sandra worked for a nonprofit that contracted with Washoe County's emergency shelter services, and she had been tasked with developing a proposal for the county office about alternative shelter configurations for extreme cold weather events, configurations tested in actual conditions rather than proposed in conference rooms by people who had never spent a January night outside. She photographed the structure from multiple angles and took detailed notes while Mara walked her through each design decision. And when she asked Mara where the knowledge came from, Mara told her. She described the Passive House internship in Portland, the thermal dynamics coursework at Nevada, and the design review where she had stood up and contradicted the department chair, and the expulsion that followed, and the appeal that went nowhere. Sandra wrote the name of the professor in her notebook and then looked up with an expression that contained something careful in it, not quite pity, and not quite something else. She said she thought she recognized that name. She said she had heard that there had been some kind of administrative proceeding involving him last fall. Mara asked what kind of proceeding. Sandra said she was not sure of the details, but that she thought it had not gone well for him. Mara sat with that for a moment. She did not feel the sudden lightning that a person might expect to feel on receiving news they have been waiting years to hear. She felt something more complicated, the particular weight of a vindication that arrives after you have already reorganized your life around the absence of it. She wrote in the blue notebook that night for a long time. Not temperatures, not thermal observations, but something else entirely, something she had not written down before and did not share with anyone. The proposal Sandra Vale submitted to Washoe County that March included a technical section on thermally efficient micro-shelter construction drawing directly on the principles Mara had described, with photographs of the Eastgate sleeping box as the primary documented example. The proposal went through 3 rounds of institutional review, encountered predictable friction at the budget analysis stage, and was not adopted immediately, but it was not discarded. It was filed in the County Emergency Management Archive, where it was referenced 18 months later by a staff analyst named Marcus Webb, who was revising the county's extreme cold weather response protocol. Webb incorporated language about small volume insulated shelter construction into the revised protocol. That language was reviewed and approved by the county board. The revision also went before a community advisory committee that included a member named David Harmon, who had attended the University of Nevada's architecture program several years before Mara, and who had followed the story of her expulsion with a sense of injustice he had never had a formal channel to act on. Harmon had served on the committee for 2 years and had, in fact, been the one who recommended that Sandra Vale's proposal be routed to the Emergency Management Archive rather than discarded. He had recognized the Eastgate work from Sandra's photographs and had made sure the document was treated as something more than an anecdote. Spring arrived in Reno the way it always does, tentatively, with false warmth in late February, followed by a cold snap in March that caught everyone off guard, and then, finally, by the middle of April, with a genuine and sustained warmth that made the nights at Eastgate survivable without a heat source. Mara had started working day labor through a construction staffing agency on Commerce Loop in early March, taking cleanup and hauling work and whatever light framing jobs came through the rotation. The foreman at the first regular framing site she was assigned to was a man named Ray Okonkwo, compact and precise, originally from San Antonio, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made every common mistake early and thoroughly and learned from all of them. He noticed Mara on the second day, specifically the way she measured by marking rather than taping, and the way she held a board before cutting it, reading the grain the way a person reads a sentence before deciding how to respond to it. At the end of the week, he asked her where she had done her training. She told him she had been expelled from the architecture program at Nevada. Ray looked at her for a moment and then said that in his experience, the people who learned from the work itself were more useful than the people who learned from the program, and that the two groups were less overlapping than the program liked to pretend. He offered her consistent work the following Monday, and it became full-time by the end of April. And by the 1st of May, she had accumulated enough saved pay to put down a deposit on a small room in a boarding house 4 miles from the Eastgate yard. She did not leave the camp immediately. She stayed through the end of April, and in the final week she was there, she was approached every day by someone from Eastgate, from the adjacent park encampment, from the network of people who moved between both places, who had heard about the sleeping box and wanted to understand it. She explained it each time with the same patience. She showed the wall cavity, the floor system, the door seal, the tea light heater nested in its 2 clay pots. She described the difference between building for volume and building for thermal retention, and why the conventional instinct toward larger always worked against a person in a context where body heat was the only heat available. 2 days before she moved out, Pete Harlow appeared at the east fence with a length of good structural lumber balanced over one shoulder. He set it down beside the material pile without speaking. Mara thanked him. He nodded and left. That was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. She dismantled the sleeping box on the last 2 days of April, taking it apart carefully in the order she had built it, and sorted the material back into organized piles along the east fence, with the structural lumber separated from the facing boards and the foam offcuts stacked flat to stay dry. The lumber did not go back into a dumpster. The blue notebook went into her tool bag, where it sat beside the pole saw and the bit roll and the combination square. On her first morning commuting to Ray's job site by bus, the route passed within 3 blocks of the Eastgate yard. She looked out the window as the bus rolled past the east fence. The material piles were still there. Caleb Marsh was standing next to them, measuring a board against a reference piece the way she had shown him, marking rather than taping, and she watched him make the mark and set the board on the saw bench and pick up the pole saw, and then the bus moved on. 2 years later, on an unremarkable Tuesday in March, a link arrived in her email inbox from Tom Brecker, the city field inspector who had photographed the structure that second afternoon of framing. The link went to a Washoe County emergency management document. She clicked through to the relevant section and read it. The language described construction specifications for thermally efficient temporary shelters for use in extreme cold weather events. In the acknowledgement section, the document cited field-documented practices observed at the Eastgate Rail Corridor during the winter of 2009. Her name was not there. She sat with the screen for a moment, then closed the laptop, picked up the blue notebook from the desk beside it, and held it in both hands without opening it. She had written the first entry on the night of October 14th of that year in a box the size of a coffin that was not a coffin, while a candle flame stood vertical in the dark, and the temperature outside fell to 23 degrees, and the temperature inside, slowly and without drama, and according to principles that had been true long before she applied them, rose. She put the notebook in her tool bag, pulled on her work coat, and went to catch the bus. The work was waiting, and that, at the end of everything, was what she had always wanted. Not the acknowledgement, not the restoration, not the vindication, just the work and the knowledge to do it well, and a place to do it that recognized what that was worth. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me which part hit hardest and where in the world you're watching from.
The most dangerous thing in the world isn't weapon. It's a person who knows they're right and build the proof with our hand. Mara Kellen was expelled, dismissed, and left out in the cold. Literally, she had no degree, no career, no power tool. What she had was something no institution could take away: deep heart, earth, knowledge, and the courage to chart it. She didn't aware. She didn't pray for recognition. She built 14 days. Service number from buoy from dumpster and a box that stay warm. Administration, not by luck, not by physics, by thinking the problem or the weather. Here was this story really about the system will sometimes fail you. Professor fail you. appear for you. Your name gets left off the document that brought you were right all along. But Lolis never find you. What you truly understand in your pony, the real work and real failure. Nobody can grasp away from you. The crow doesn't care about your credentials. The crow only care about what you actually view. So build something. The work is waiting.